So I'm not going to dance around this anymore. I'm just going to pick a color and get moving. The first color, this is the hardest. What we're doing is an exercise in relative comparison. And the more information that's correct that we have to compare against, the easier it becomes to make each successive choice. Right now, we have nothing. Well, that's not true. We have middle gray, neutral gray. What I want to do is to figure out probably the unshadowed cloth. So one of these greens in here is going to be a good bit because it covers a lot of the canvas. So it will then give me clues for, the next colors I'll pick. I'm probably going to get it wrong. This is the beauty of the exercise. You'll get better by doing this, but it's always going to be hard. There's really no magic to this, especially with the first one. It's very much a kind of a best guess. You'll also hear me going quieter in this video than I do in many of my other videos, because what I'm doing is carefully looking. And I apologize in advance for getting kind of quiet while I do it, but you'll find that this takes a lot of concentration. The brush I'm going to use for this, it doesn't really matter. I happen to be using one called Charcoal Side for a lot of this just because it's kind of big and fun. I've included that in the series. Really, you can use whatever you want. I'm going to cover more of the canvas than the green cloth actually does, just because what I want to do is start really just filling up space. Now I compare. And when I look at those two, the first thing that jumps out at me is that it's slightly too cool. This green here is a little more towards yellow. So I'm just going to push the hue ever so slightly. Value, it's hard to say. Maybe mine's a little bright, so I'm going to drop it down in value a tiny bit as well. Okay, that I'd say is probably a better starting point. Clearly there's a lot of different values and different colors going on within the cloth as it's shadowed and modeled, but this is a good starting point. Now I'm going to pick another big area. So I'm going to do this gray right here, or black actually. It's a black cloth. It's tempting to look at that and say, oh, it's just black. Well, clearly it's not black. What I've done here, I should slow down. I'm going to always select a color I'm going to compare with. And right now the only one I have is green. So I'll select green first with the eyedropper. Then I'll open the color picker. And now I have my current and new boxes to use as a comparison tool. What I'm trying to do is to look at this threshold edge between the cloth and the black background and try and match that contrast. That's the strongest piece of evidence I have. Of course, it relies on this initial green being correct, and I'd say it's close enough, but it's all I've got. So I will start by dragging it down to a lower value because I know it's a lower value. I also know that it's probably less saturated, so I'll make it less saturated. What I see here is something that's too warm or too green. I'm going to actually try changing the hue now. So since I've pulled it so close to almost gray, I could pick almost any hue and it really wouldn't change that much. We're really at 5% saturation, so these are all really just grays. But I'm going to pick a bluish and then maybe bring the saturation back up a tiny bit. And then the value also. That's looking pretty close to me. Again, I'm looking at the threshold between those two colors and I'm trying to match that same threshold here. I'll give that a try. Okay, I think it's not dark enough. The hue's about right though. I'm going to drop it down a little bit in darkness and just paint right over top. I am pretty satisfied with that. So I'm kind of darting my eyes back and forth, looking at this and looking at this. I can look at them easily on the same screen at one time, but to you it'll look like I'm just sort of frozen. Know that when I pause like this, what I'm doing is I'm looking left and right and comparing. As just a little aside here, what if I had just made this black? Look how different that is. This is a blue compared to this black. You know, if you zoom way in, this swatch here really looks like blue. The beauty is once we finish the illustration, it's not going to look like blue. In this photograph, it doesn't really look like blue. It looks like black, but that's because of the general color cast of the entire image. Black is never pure black. Black has a little bit of some hue relative to the objects surrounding it and the color of the light. These are the things we learn when we do very careful color studies like these. You have to trust your eyes and ignore your brain. Okay, enough theory. What's next? I guess I could do the terracotta pot. We'll say that's a pretty big element of the composition, so it's probably good to get that in place. I could choose any of these different areas to start with. What I'm going to focus on is the illuminated bit here. That's about the most neutral the color is. The hue, it's pretty orange. Maybe a little more towards the yellow. Okay, this is a good example. Here what I did was I got ahead of myself. I was looking at the color and I'm trying to pick blind. I have one more piece of evidence that I can use, which is it's surrounded by a green that I've already locked in place. Great first step to do is first select the green you have and then go to pick your new color. So now I have current and new. And when I go to try and pick the terracotta color, here I can compare it against the background, which it has right next to it. You'll notice I'm never color sampling from the photo. What I am doing is using evidence that I have created. And if I can trust that green background color, this is going to help me pick the terracotta color with a little bit more accuracy. Because remember, if you can use a relative border color, your eyes will do a much better job picking it. I think that's pretty close. We'll see how it looks. I'm going to paint this on its own layer. It doesn't really matter how you do it. That's, well, I don't know. I think it's in the zone. I'm not going to be able to tell how close I got really until I put in a few more tones. Let's move ahead to as this rolls into shadow and then the reflected light. There's just so much of the canvas devoted to this terracotta that I think I'm going to do it. So I'll start by selecting this orange to compare against. And the shadow here gets definitely darker. I feel like it gets redder also. Yeah, let's give that a try. This is going to be tough because here we have a very gradual transition. But what I've done is essentially blocked in two color blocks, shadow color, highlight color. And obviously that throws off our perception a little bit. So if you want to, you can see how it's looking by kind of doing on-screen blending and finding a middle mixture there. The more we get fussy about blending here, we'll kind of get off track. The beauty of this is that if you just pick the right colors, it'll give a general impression of accuracy or of realism, even though the painting is very, very loose. This is really not an assignment you want to zoom in on too much. Okay, what I'm noticing here is that the value I've selected here is way too light. It's actually much more. Down here, the values are almost all the same as this core shadow. So I'm going to pick the value of that core shadow and use it here. One trick you can do is to kind of unfocus your eyes a little bit. And in doing so, you're able just to see value transitions better. You're not allowing yourself to get kind of bogged down mentally by all the little details and thinking like, oh, this is a pot. I've seen a pot before. I know it has these properties. If you kind of unfocus your eyes or even cross your eyes, what you get is a more objective look at things. You get a sort of an abstracted, simplified version. Okay, so the last thing I want to do here is look at this reflected light. So I have actually a second light off scene here. There's a warm light on the left and a cool light on the right. What I see is about the same value as the right side of the terracotta. What's different though is it's a lot redder. So I'm going to, I think I'll use, the value on the right as a starting point. So I'll pick that first and then open the color picker. I want about the same value, but I want it to be redder in hue. And you can see just in changing it redder in hue, it actually made it darker in value. And this is something we talked about in the last couple series if you've been following along. So what I want to do is keep it optically about the same, which means I need to raise the value. So those are about the same value visually. We'll see how that looks. It might be too red. Okay, wow. So way too bright, way too red. That means I'm going to push it back a little towards orange and move down and right, which is lower value, more saturated. That looks better to me. Still too bright. So I'm going to bring it down in value, see how we do. Okay, I'm happier with that. Your eyes play tricks on you. This will get easier as we have more information filled in on the canvas. But when you're just starting out here, there are so many opportunities to get tricked by border colors. Like this green here is not the right green because we have a dark shadow here to compare against. It's harder for me to get the color of this orange correct because all I have to base it on is the core shadow. And I have to essentially ignore what's happening here to the left because I haven't filled that in yet. So let's do that next. If I can say that this orange is pretty close, I'll select that first. And now my new color is going to be a black. So one thing I could do first is say, is it the same as this other black that's already on the canvas? And when you look at these, your gut instinct is to say, yes, they are the same. Well, I think actually, the more I compare the two, I think the one on the left is darker. Now, if you want to cheat a little bit, you can compare it to the black of the background. And if I do that, I can say, oh, actually the black of the background is much more similar to this shadow than it is similar to this black cloth. These two are clearly dark and light. Over here, it's dark and pretty dark. What that tells me is it's darker than this blue I've put here. So I have a 13% brightness. I know it's darker than 13% brightness. And I know it's slightly brighter than pure black because I can see it. You know, it stands out a little bit from this background, but it's close. So maybe that means it's like 5% value, but it probably is grabbing hue from this green I already have. So I'll start with this green actually, and then bring it down to like a 5 or 6%. That's probably pretty good. And we'll see how that does. I'm not going to worry too much about the termination, how it kind of goes off into fabric folds. That's a detail that's going to throw me off track. What I want to know is, does it look like the right darkness? And I think it actually gets darker still right down here. That might be pure black. So right while I'm at it, I'm also going to drop that down all the way to black and then make a quick transition. I'm doing this on its own layer just so I can kind of keep my borders cleaner. All right, it's probably a good moment to actually fill in a little more of the background. So if we look at the original green I selected was sort of this green over here. Compare that to this green over here, and it's quite a bit darker over here. Also, there's these dark shadows of the folds. Let's start by just getting the general darker value over here. I think it's probably about that much darker. What I'm doing is I'm comparing it to the current background I have, which is sort of this over here. I think it's maybe a little darker. It's hard to see because there's so much canvas distance between the two, but we'll see how this goes. To me, that looks not saturated enough. The value might be right, but I think it's not saturated enough. So if I want to make it more saturated, I'll add saturation. The problem here is that's then also made it look darker. So I need to then compensate by raising the value a little bit. And I think that's a little too warm, so I'm going to keep everything else the same, but drag it a little towards blue. No, that's too saturated, so I'm going to pull saturation out a bit. That's tough. I think that's still too saturated, so I'm going to pull saturation out and try and compensate to keep value the same. Yeah, I'm happier. Yeah, we'll leave it there. I know I'm going to have trouble with the light bulb if I don't put these few shadows in place, so I'm just sampling from elsewhere in the canvas. It's probably about right. You'll notice I'm going right over top of where the light bulb's going to be. I'm not concerned about that. I'm just going to kind of work from back to forward. I also think in this middle zone, it should get a little darker, a little more saturated maybe. It's a lot of back and forth. A lot of comparing. It gets easier the further you get into the image, but at this point there's still some key issues that are not established in the canvas yet. So it's really hard to know if these colors are hitting the mark. Okay, one final thing I see is that there's actually this bit of warm light in the canvas here, or in the cloth. I'm going to see if I can do that. It gets a little, so it starts here, it gets a little darker, and it also gets warmer. So I'm just going to pull it a little towards yellow. And then I have to pull down the value a little bit to compensate because yellow tends to brighten things up. We'll see how that looks. I think it's not orange enough. Still not yellow enough. More saturation, so pull it down darker to compensate. I'm happier with that. It's tricky because what you want to do is really focus on one area and get zoomed in and keep adding more and more detail. The way we really accomplish our goal here is to stay as zoomed out as possible and work on big areas of the canvas. If you've gotten any of the other videos in the Control Paint store, you know that I like to break up these chapters either based on sort of milestones throughout the project or based on conceptual ideas. Well, sadly, this demo doesn't really have either of those things. So I'm just going to put a break here and then we'll continue working in the next video.